Okay, in this presentation, I'm just going to talk about the difference between theory and ideology. And I'm doing this because students often make the mistake of equating the two, or they think that, or they characterize some of the theories we're studying as ideologies, which is incorrect from the point of view of most of what we do in social science. And so I want to get into, okay, what is the difference between a theory and an ideology? Because they are similar. And so that's what this presentation is about. Theory. Uh, my definition is that, and I am a theorist, right? That's my thing. I can do data, but my background is I'm a theorist. And so uh, I'm big, and I say I have this based on this Hempel point of view that I shared with you in other videos, that it's an explanation of a phenomenon based on underlying, perhaps unobserved phenomenon or phenomena. And that is to say, it explains a dependent variable, that's the first phenomena, as the causal effect of other things. And so it tells, like I say, it tells us a causal story. Kelstadt and Witten, much simpler. They say it's a tentative conjecture about the causes of some phenomena of interest. Now, tentative conjecture is the kind of thing that theorists are not going to like, but that's about right. It's tentative because it needs to be tested, right? That's the essence of science. We come up with ideas, propositions about the way the world works. Call them conjectures if you must, but they're conjectures and they're tentative until we test them, right? That's the difference between a belief, right? When you have a belief, you don't necessarily subject it to test, right? And so that's one reason I'm gonna, when people say that Waltz believes this, that's hard. That's sometimes, a belief is something you think to be true, and can they be tested? Yes, but it's a kind of thing we don't like. We don't like belief, right? We like argues, like conjectures, right? These kinds of things, because this is the essence, that they are tentative until tested. But key thing about a theory, it predicts outcomes, right? It tells us a causal story, and in that sense is very positive. What do we mean by positive? Positivism is an approach to research and philosophy, and you can find positivism and things like post-positivism talked about in different contexts uh, out there, right? And some of them are relevant to IR, some of them are relevant to other things, right? So you have to be careful. These are words that are used by, in various contexts. But positivism in social science research is just basically this approach to it. It's a philosophy of research. And here we can use the word believe, right? Because now we're talking about researchers acting on the belief. They're like, this is how we should study the world, right? And they aren't necessarily testing it. It's not a tentative conjecture waiting on testing. It's like, no, this is something that I think we properly use the word belief, right? Because this is a commitment of value, and it's value laden in ways that a lot of the positivists don't think it is there. And so the key thing about positivism, the overarching view, is it's about it's the approach. It's a scientific, what we think of as a scientific approach to studying social science, right? And that is, the focus is on facts, right? We're trying to look at facts about the world, not values, right? We are taking, this is something that you might find weird, but the belief that facts are in fact are inherently independent of observers, right? That we can look at the world and that when we define things, we aren't creating knowledge. We aren't creating a value division. We aren't creating new meanings for things, right? Then, in fact, meanings are independent of observation, right? Which is, constructivists are going to be all over this one, okay? Causality. Here's the big thing. Causality can be identified and studied. right? This idea that one thing causes another and that we can isolate the effect, although there might be multiple causalities, there might be confounding influences, we can at least see the partial effect of something and we can partially explain phenomena. And we can, in fact, tease out this causal relationship, right? That's a belief that it exists and that people can challenge, and post-positivists will. I'm not getting into that now, you know. And here is what's really important. Theory is about predicting behavior and outcome. Theory is just saying, look, this is the way things are. This is the causal relationship. X causes Y, right? And there's no value judgment here. It's just this is the way it is, right? And this goes back to the idea that we can objectively look at the world. We know we're biased. We know we're humans. We don't think, but we can be objective, and therefore we try to be objective, and we try to create a system of research and of publishing research that has it reviewed by other people, and we attempt to be in our studies, we attempt to be objective by being systematic, defining things in transparent ways that other people can see and cross-examine, and having a approach to the questions that, a big part of being objective is this whole idea of being tentative. And the whole idea of testing things is about, well, we think this is the way the world works, but we're going to test it. And inherent in this is this idea of, hey, we can do this and we should try to do this, right? And so this is what we're about. So my definition here of theory is very much a positivist one. And the distinction I'm about to draw between theory and ideology is very much a positivist point of view. And I wanted to make sure you understood that, right? A lot of what I'm teaching you is positivism, right, in this course. And so because I'm emphasizing the methods and stuff, and the quantitative methods that are standard in the discipline are typically positivist. They aren't exclusively, and so there is room for other stuff, but they tend to be. So let's just go with this, and we'll put a pin in what post-positivism is for maybe even not even in this course, later in the program, maybe. Ideology. Leon Baradot had this definition, and that I've always found useful, and I've gone with it, right? That ideology has 4 characteristics. One, it's a political term, right? It is not a scientific term. It is about politics and achieving political objectives. So it's inherently political. And his second thing, and here's where the theory, I think, comes in, because it contains a view of the current world, right? And just in that, it contains a view of the current world. Well, what is that view? That view is probably a causal story, right? An explanation of how, a model of the world, an explanation of how the world works. And so I always say, at this point, I look at that and I say, oh, you mean a theory, right? And a good ideology is going to have embedded in it a theory of how the world works, right? And so theories are embedded in ideologies, and therefore they're very close, because someone who is espousing an ideology will probably be espousing a theory of causal relationships in the world. And, that's something that makes it look a lot like a theory, right? But what it adds a vision of some desirable future, a goal, an end state, right? And so it doesn't just say this is the way the world is. This is the way we want the world to be, right? We want to get to something. Either we want to get to something, or maybe we want to avoid something. And now, a lot of IR theory treats war as something to be avoided, although we talk about predicting it. Realism, kind of just predicts it, but there is kind of an implied thing that, yes, you probably don't want to have a war if you can avoid it. And in economics, there is the assumption that, they tend to look at things as more money is better, right? They assume that people have that as their individual goal. And economists usually say, hey, if we can achieve some kind of efficient thing, so there's often a weak normative goal in a science or discipline that is kind of a typical thing they try to explain, and it manifests as an interest in a particular dependent variable, and it goes maybe beyond that. And that's what the post-positivists will definitely jump on and say, no, it goes way beyond that, Dave. You are spewing BS at your students right now. Okay. But the point of an ideology is it has a stronger, more explicit normative view of the world and a desire, and it focuses on a goal rather than simply just trying to say, okay, this is what's going to happen, right? Let the chips fall where they may. It's like, no, we want the chips to fall a certain way. So and then the third part is it includes steps to be taken, right? An action plan. It says, this is what we need to do to get there, right? And so in a lot of ways, ideology is taking a theory, a causal understanding of the world, adding a normative goal, and then trying to make an argument of how do we get there, right? And it's usually based on the theory in some way. Hopefully, I mean, if you have two brain cells working, although some ideologies are looser than others on this point. Finally, the big thing about it is ideologies are directed toward the masses, right? They are not directed towards other social scientists. That would be esoteric. When the meaning of the word esoteric is not complicated, or it's usually taken as that, as abstract or complicated. But what it really means is aimed at an internal audience. And so esoteric communications are communications that are, you are assuming you have a in-group that with a common understanding. And we have a lot of people in the military take our classes, and in the military, you understand what's esoteric, right? It's when you're talking amongst yourselves and you can use common acronyms, common expressions, and common points of view, and you don't have to explain every damn thing to somebody. Well, that's being esoteric, right? And when people say they can't understand what you're talking about, that's because they're not in your group. When you talk to outside your group, well, that's exoteric, and you are attempting to explain something to people who do not have the same background as you and the same vocabulary and the same knowledge and all that stuff, right? So that's the masses. And so a ideology is generally aimed, if not at the literal masses like socialism was supposedly aimed at, it's aimed at political actors outside your group, right? And so it's not aimed at an internal discussion amongst people. It's supposed to be political advocacy, right? That's the point of it, right? You're trying to convince people, right? So there's this aspect of being, you are going outside your little group to whatever that little group, I don't want to be diminutive, but you're esoteric, the SO, you're going to the X, right? You're going exo. You're going out amongst people, trying to convince people, right? And that is why ideologies are inherently political. Okay, now the Baradot book goes into like socialism and fascism and populism. It goes into the big isms, but theories can be, you almost want to use the term weaponized, politicized, in the sense that they can be activated, they can form the basis of an ideology. And one example I think that came up, and that wasn't necessarily, wasn't obvious, right? I mean, it's obvious that socialism is an ideology, right? Although the way people call it, when people say, oh, so-and-so is a socialist, I'm like, you keep using this word, I don't think it means what you think it does. It doesn't, but let's look at something that is, I would argue, an ideology, and that's neoconservatism. And the neocons were an element in the international relations community that, under the Bush administration, that largely advocated, they were big advocates for the invasion of Iraq. And what they did, they took the democratic piece, that's what DPT is, and we're going to have that's a liberal, and interestingly, this is a liberal theory. of course, liberal, when we talk about IR, has nothing to do with left and right and, conservative or liberal. And even they're stuck. Even Democrats, they're calling themselves progressives today. So the L word is, kind of moving away in some ways. But when we use liberal, we mean something very different. But they took the idea of democratic peace, this idea that the type of regime matters, right, as their view of the world. And they had a vision of a peaceful Middle East. They kind of looked at it and said, look, Saddam Hussein is causing a lot of trouble for Israel. And, where you have democracies, they get along and they don't fight. And so if we had a stable democracy in Iraq, this would bolster the Middle East. It would stop the fighting against Israel. It would provide us with a bulwark against Iran. And so it was all based logically on democratic peace theory. And with the goal was achieving a peaceful Middle East that was more, in the U.S. and Israel's interest. And so they advocated regime change in Iraq, and they were pushing, one way to get there was let's go to war, right? Let's invade Iraq. And these guys were very much, pushing this vision that, invading Iraq could have all these great outcomes, right? And so they were they pushing this on the masses? Well, they were certainly going out and talking to Congress, and they were out trying to appeal outside their policy thing. I don't know that they were, like I say, to masses. You might find neocons as part of a policy group. So that, but I hope you see what I'm saying, that we add into the theory a vision and a proposed set of actions and an advocacy, right? A political advocacy that makes this thing inherently political. And that takes a theory and moves it to an ideology. So the key thing is, when you look at Waltz, he's got a theory of IR, or Mearsheimer, right? And these guys and I know the names I mentioned, these guys are very much trying to be positivist, and they're trying to study the world and identify cause and effect relationships, and they are trying to explain the world as it is. Now, individually, they may at times advocate things. They may go outside the lines of positivism, right? Because everyone does. And post-positivists will say, well, that means that the lines are BS. Maybe, I don't know. But in terms of the theory, we don't study Waltz to understand Waltz's opinions on things. We study Waltz's work. And, by the way, when you cite someone, you are citing that particular work, right? When you say Waltz 1978, I think it is, or 79, when you make that citation, you're talking about his book and the theory and the ideas that are there, not Kenneth Waltz as an individual, right? Individuals, in a sense, when we write about them and when we use them, they are the sum of their writings. And we don't talk about them beyond that. What they do beyond that is irrelevant, right? Because the writing is the point, right? And there is, again, in positivism, this idea that at some point we are in a role as a researcher being objective. And we can be objective, and as researchers, we should be objective. But that means that there are times when we step out of that role and we are a political entity. We, have our own beliefs and our values, and we pursue them. Right. And again, the positivist critical theorists, a lot of people say, well, no, there's not this clean separation. Okay. But this is my point. Generally, we tend to be positivist. And when you cross the line, you have to be very careful about it. So generally, so Waltz is telling you a theory, right? Realists are not espousing an ideology. Could you have an ideology based on realism? Perhaps, although realism is just so pessimistic. It'd be harder. It's easier to have ideologies based on the liberal ideas, honestly, because liberalism was an ideology, right? Cobden was, not a clear-cut, there wasn't this positivist distinction, and you kind of see that in other folks. But this is something to be aware of, and the lines are not sharp, the lines are not impenetrable, there are gray areas, and some people say it's that deny that you should make this distinction, but it's there. That's the difference between theory and ideology, and I just want everyone to have that in mind. And so that took 20 minutes. I hope that was worth it for everyone. But I do think if we want to avoid you uh, uh, you know, saying something, waving a red flag at your readers, at your professors, at other folks when you're writing by calling a theory an ideology.